By the late 1950s, the Garand had seen service in World War II. It had seen service in Korea. It was considered somewhat long in the tooth, and a program was initiated to develop a so-called lightweight rifle. Well, this lightweight rifle, through a series of prototypes and tribulations, both politically and mechanically, would end up being what we now know as the M14. Interestingly, the M14 really only lightened the M1 Garand's burden for the individual soldier to the tune of about 5 ounces in terms of the empty platform itself. What did help somewhat was that the ammunition by that time had essentially evolved from the 30-06 cartridge into what became the 7.62x51 NATO cartridge.
With the revisions to the feed system, revisions to the gas system, they come up with a rifle that's designated T-44 that is adopted then by the American military in 1957. And that inaugurates the era of the M14 rifle. And the M14 rifle beat out some impressive competition at the time because the U.S. military was also considering the T-48 rifle, which was basically a North American produced version of the FN-FAL rifle. The military decides to go with the M14 in 1957, and it enters mass production, where it's produced by Springfield Armory up until its closure. It's produced by Winchester Repeating Arms, and then Thompson, Ramo, and Wooldridge.
The M14 is Garand-like in a lot of ways. It's still got that same operating rod handle. Even though it has a detachable box magazine, it still has that rotating bolt at the top of the action. It can be stripper clip fed through the top of the action if need be. But the M14 does have some notable differences. And a lot of these differences come from the fact that the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, at the time that they were developing the M14, was looking for a general purpose arm that would replace a lot of other guns in the U.S. arsenal at this time.
The M14 never did reach the really unrealistic goal of replacing the Garand, the carbine, the M3, and the BAR. That goal was never realistic to begin with, and so if you measure the M14's success after 1.3 million rifles made by 4 contractors over a multi-year period, observed in that manner, the M14 can be considered somewhat of a failure. But if you look at the M14 as a refinement of the M1 Garand, did it achieve those goals? Did it serve well in the jungles of Vietnam? Did it go on later to serve in roles as a designated marksman rifle in places like Afghanistan? Then certainly it's really hard to judge it poorly.
In the early 1960s, there was this thought that we really had to go to a far more advanced battle rifle than we had with the M14. The British had gone to SLR rifles. We had T-48s that they'd experimented with, but nothing had really worked up to a really small, handy, lightweight rifle with plastic stocks. And Eugene Stoner, who was working for Fairchild Industries at the time, he was developing several different entire weapon systems.
There was then a development by Armalite, a division of Fairchild Aircraft, of this rifle that becomes eventually AR-15, that follows the small caliber high velocity concept. The idea that instead of arming your troops with a 30 caliber semi-auto or select fire service rifle, you arm them with something that is a much more modest size cartridge in terms of bullet diameter that's moving at a higher velocity, with the thought being that the individual rifleman is then carrying more ammunition. That will ultimately culminate with the development, first of all, of the AR-15. That will lead to full standardization in February '67 of the Army version M16A1. And this is a select fire rifle making extensive use of aircraft-grade aluminums And the cartridge that it's initially developed for, we to this day refer to it as XM193, and that is a .223 caliber bullet weighing in at 55 grains that leaves a 20-inch barrel moving at almost 3,300 feet per second, a very, very fast-moving bullet.
These, then, are the things you must remember and do to keep your rifle ready to go when you need it.
The M16 was significantly lighter, significantly more controllable than many of the previous U.S. Army issue guns. It weighed something on the order of like 6.5 pounds. And a lot of this was due to its really, frankly, kind of a space age sort of construction. It had a forged aluminum receiver set instead of the steel receivers that were seen on the M14 and the M1 Garand. It used a polymer furniture set. This was like a Zytel polymer in the triangular handguard. It used a polymer buttstock. And the .223 chambering was much more controllable on full auto than the 7.62 NATO really was in the M14.
When it fights in Vietnam, it immediately makes a name for itself as being ideal in almost every way, almost across the board. The initial versions that are distributed among South Vietnamese troops, for example, during Project Agile in 1963, that's a version, the Colt 601, the Colt 602. These are early developmental versions that precede the M16A1. They do very well. Then eventually the Army begins a process of test and evaluation of the XM16E1. It goes overseas with U.S. troops. The firearm does extraordinarily well in combat. That, to no insignificant level, paves the way for the full adoption of the M16, M16A1. The only problem is that while that's happening, a number of problems develop that are clearly associated with two things. Number one, ammunition. Number two, the fact that there is no chrome lining on the chamber or the bore. That would lead eventually then to the I-Cord committee. This is a 3-man committee that submits a 48-page long report in October of 1967, recommending the clarification of the type of powder that can be used in the weapon that keeps the weapon within safe operating parameters, and then chrome lining of both the bore and the chamber. When that happens, the firearm is excellent. The problems have been solved.
Ultimately, a lot of soldiers that used this in Vietnam seemed to like the M16A1. And this was the design that would go on until the present day in large part. The M16A1 is what would evolve through a series of different designs. You have the A2, the A4, and ultimately, even in Vietnam, you had small compact carbine variants of the M16 that were developed for use by select units like the MAC-VSOG guys. These compact carbine variants eventually evolved into kind of its own subgroup, and the U.S. Army experimented with these into the 1970s and 1980s. The term that we see for this is the XM177E2. And while these were experimented with, they weren't really codified until the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that's when they finally decide, warfare has changed. We are getting in and out of vehicles. We're working in tight confines. We need to take into consideration that, we're entering urban areas where there's going to be conflict in close quarters. We need a shorter, more compact platform. And that's when you see the first iteration of the M4 carbine developed.
The M4 enters service, and it doesn't take very long for a few shortcomings associated with the M4's design to make themselves kind of well-known. Some operators wanted a firearm that was capable of delivering a greater cyclic rate of fire, and they wanted the full auto mechanism instead of the unusual and uncomfortable trigger pull associated with 3-round burst. The military then realizes if you give them the selector setting of full auto fire, there's also a likelihood that they'll overheat the weapon, and this is proven in the Battle of Wanat in Afghanistan, where M4 carbines quickly begin overheating. And so that leads to the M4A1, and the M4A1 has an enhanced, heavier barrel profile, still has the notable notch for the M203 grenade launcher, and beneath the handguards, rather than tapering to save weight on the firearm, There's a full-length heavy barrel profile in the weapon. In addition to that, selector setting for full auto fire.
That is a design that really has continued to evolve in small marginal ways to accommodate the rise of different optics, different accessories, different pieces of equipment that are designed to suit whatever the mission is at hand. But ultimately, the M4, M4A1 still at its heart is the same M16 operating system that was adopted in the mid-1960s. And it continues to be one of the essential frontline arms today, despite the fact that there's been a lot of talk recently about what is the future of small arms in the US military. Of course, you have the Sig Sauer XM7 now that's being adopted in field in small numbers. And you have the development of a 6.8 by 51 millimeter cartridge that is slated to potentially replace the 5.56 NATO, which is what the 223 Remington was designated as in 1980. So while there's a lot of discussion and a lot of experimentation about what the future of U.S. Army small arms looks like, still today we rely on that iconic AR action designed by Eugene Stoner.